This is the story of Rick Hall and Fame Studios. Fame Studios, located in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, is one of the most iconic recording studios in American history. Technically established in 1959 by producer Rick Hall, and we'll talk about why I just said technically in this episode. Fame, which stands for Florence, Alabama Music Enterprises, gained legendary status in the 1960s and 70s especially as the birthplace of the Muscle Shoals sound. The Muscle Shoals sound is known as, and still is, this unique blend of Southern soul, rock, and country. It attracted some of the biggest names in music, including Aretha Franklin and Wilson Pickett, Otis Redding, the Allman Brothers. Known for its unassuming exterior but electric interior atmosphere, Fame Studios ultimately brought together a very talented and famous house band, the Swampers, who crafted groundbreaking sounds that defined countless hits. Today, Fame Studios continues to operate as both a working studio and a historic landmark, preserving its legacy as a crucial part of American music culture. But Rick Hall's journey to founding Fame Studios was marked by profound hardships and resilience. In fact, his story is one of my favorite of all time. Through sheer grit and vision, Rick Hall transformed his personal pain into a powerhouse that defined the Muscle Shoals sound and made an indelible mark on the music world. This, my friends, is the story of Rick Hall. Rick was originally born Roe Arista Hall on January 31st, 1932. He was born into a farming family in Mississippi. His father was Herman Hall, a sawmill worker and sharecropper. His mother, Dolly Hall, took care of the family. In all of the Google searches that you do of Rick, it says he had one sister, but he actually also had a baby brother. His baby brother, however, died in a very tragic way when Rick was very young. The death of his baby brother would be the first of many personal tragedies Rick would face in his life. One day, his mother, Dolly, was out doing the laundry in the yard. She had a very big barrel for the laundry of boiling water. She was washing their clothes, and the baby brother was out playing in the fields. Rick was 4 at the time, so his baby brother would have been around 2 years old. His baby brother was running and ultimately somehow backed himself up into the boiling water. He was instantly completely burned from his head to his toes. Dolly started screaming and carrying the baby out into the field where Rick's father was. Once Dolly got to her husband Herman, they rushed Rick's baby brother to the doctor in town, where the toddler soon passed away. After this incident, Dolly and Herman started fighting and bickering quite a bit. Rick says that he kind of thinks his father could have blamed Dolly for the accident, or maybe Dolly just felt a lot of guilt over this accident because she was the one responsible for watching the baby while she was washing the clothes. But either way, Dolly felt like she just was not cut out to be a mother. When Rick was about 5 years old, so just 1 year after his baby brother's very tragic death, Dolly left their home and left the family. After his mother left, Rick's father, Herman, was the one who raised him and his sister. To help the children and himself overcome the grief of the loss of their brother and now their mother, Rick's father decided to move the family from Forest Grove, Mississippi to Franklin County, Alabama. Rick always spoke very highly of his father. He says his dad raised him to be hardworking and to always give 100% in anything he did. When Rick was about 15 years old, he was starting to feel like he needed to do more to take care of his grandfather, father, and sister. He knew the family was struggling with money, and he had this ambition and yearning to get out in the world and find a greater purpose and find a greater success than just being a sharecropper. So, with his father's blessing, Rick left the farm in Alabama and moved up to Rockford, Illinois to work as an apprentice tool maker. Now, being a tool maker during that time was a very good and stable profession. There was a very high demand for tool makers in the 20th century as the country faced significant industrial growth. And in addition to providing really good pay, being a tool maker also provided individuals with opportunities for growth and advancement in their careers into more supervisory roles. So this was Rick's plan, to begin a career in tool making and bring home more money for himself and his family. On the side, when Rick was not working at the tool company, he was playing guitar in local bands in Rockford. In 1950, Rick was drafted to assist in the Korean War efforts. And I believe this is when he left Illinois and moved back to Alabama, was to serve. He initially served as a conscientious objector, opting to perform non-combat duties instead of taking up arms. He later joined the honor guard of the 4th United States Army, and it was also in 1950 when Rick turned 18 years old, he and his friend Billy Sherrill decided to start a rock and R&B band. They called themselves the Fairlanes. Rick was busy serving in the Army and in his musical endeavors with Billy, but that didn't stop him from getting a little girlfriend named Faye. Throughout most of their 20s, Rick and Billy would play at various local clubs and venues in Florence, Alabama. They were also involved in various writing sessions and jam sessions around town. In 1955, Rick Hall married Faye Marie Stiegel. The two likely met through mutual friends or on the music scene in Florence. Faye was a beautiful 16-year-old in June of 1955 when she married Rick. The two needed legal parental consent to have this wedding, given the legal age to marry in Alabama with parental consent was 14 years old. Without parental consent, it was 18. The two of them could have waited 2 more years until Faye was 18 years old and they did not need parental consent, but everything truly happens for a reason, and God knew better than that. And he brought them together in 1955 for a reason. A year after Rick got married, or it could have been the year before he got married, he had saved up quite a bit of money from his apprenticeship in Illinois and from a factory job that he was working in Alabama. He decided to buy his father a brand new tractor.
The city slickers who make it say the day of the horse has gone forever. The modern tractor doesn't have to be kicked to get it off the ground. This model has a 4-cylinder hydraulic pump that makes wheel changing and tire repairs almost a pleasure.
This tractor was very expensive. It was Rick's first big purchase. I mean, he was only about on the verge of 20 years old, but he was so excited that he had the money to buy this for the family. And this tractor really was going to improve the operations of his father's farm, making things way more efficient for his dad and in turn probably allowing them to bring in more profit. Needless to say, Rick was feeling on top of the world in 1956. He was doing well financially, he was doing well in his factory job, his music was really going well with Billy. He had Faye and they were embarking on this new journey together as newlyweds. His father and family, of course, were overjoyed to see Rick having this level of success in every facet of his life. 2 years into Rick's new marriage, it was exactly 4 weeks after Faye's 18th birthday, a very horrible tragedy would take place. It was March 30th, 1957, and Rick had just taken Faye on a date night to a concert in Hackleburg, Alabama. They were driving home from the concert on a very dark country road, one Rick was not familiar with at all, when Rick missed a curve in the road and his car flipped 4 or 5 times. Faye was immediately ejected from the car and died soon after that at the hospital. Faye was buried at Shady Grove Cemetery a few days later. Rick was in a very deep state of grief and loss and a level of guilt because he was the one driving the car when tragedy would strike again. Just over 2.5 weeks after Faye's death, it was April 18th, 1957, when Rick got a call from his stepmother. She said that she had gone out to call in Rick's dad for dinner. When Rick's dad didn't respond, she went out into the field and saw that the brand new tractor Rick had bought his dad had flipped over, pinning his father underneath it. The way the tractor had pinned his father underneath it was almost the exact same way Rick's car had flipped over and killed Faye just 2.5 weeks prior. It was evident that his dad tried to claw his way out from under the tractor, which indicated that he unfortunately was still alive for a period of time after it had flipped. But his father did tragically die and left Rick with this second wave of guilt. He felt in a way responsible for Faye's death, given he had been the driver of that car, and now he felt responsible for his dad's death, given he was the one who had bought him that tractor. Rick's father, Herman, was buried at the same cemetery as Faye, Shady Grove Cemetery, number 3. So within 1 month, Rick loses his newlywed wife and his father and has to bury 2 people he loves the most in the same cemetery, in the same season of life, in the same month. Now, Herman's wife at the time, he had remarried after Dolly left the family, a woman named Willie Mae. Willie Mae was also in a very deep state of grief. I believe she moved away from that city after the father's death, and she ultimately remarried and lived a very long life. But Willie Mae's name is next to Herman's name on his headstone in Shady Grove Cemetery, and Rick Hall's name is next to Faye's name on her headstone in Shady Grove Cemetery, even though Rick would eventually be put to rest in the same cemetery as his mother, Colbert Memorial Gardens. Understandably, after his father's death, Rick went into a very deep depression. Rick started drinking heavily and living out of his car, all the while writing music on notepad paper in his free time. The one constant in Rick's life at this time seemed to be his friend Billy. When Rick wasn't in the middle of a bender or a depressive episode, he and Billy would be playing locally or writing together. Rick started to pick himself back up a little bit. After a period of time, he realized he wasn't going to get anywhere living in his car and living that life. And then towards the late 1950s, Rick started to see a little bit of a pick-me-up in his life. In 1958, Rick and Billy co-wrote a song that would be their first notable success. It was called Sweet and Innocent. 1 year later, in 1959, a local named Tom Stafford came into the picture. Tom Stafford was the son of the town's pharmacist. His father owned the City Drug Store in downtown Florence, Alabama.
The City Drug Store in Florence, Alabama was located in downtown Florence at the corner of East Tennessee and Seminary Street, its exact address being 127 East Tennessee Street. It was originally called Corner Drug Company in the 1940s, but the owners of the Corner Drug Company decided to move locations to Seminary Street and sold the location to 2 men named Sam Lishkoff and Claude Stafford in late 1950. Both Sam and Claude were already registered pharmacists with over 10 years of experience each. Sam and Claude officially opened the City Drug Store in early 1951, unknowingly opening what would become one of the most famous locations in music history. Claude Stafford was roughly 56 years old at the time the City Drug Store opened. I do want to emphasize that this really wasn't just a drugstore. They also had sandwiches and hot dogs and something everyone in town really loved, a fountain service for fountain drinks. They also sold candy and were known for, quote, the best coffee in town. The grand opening of the store was a huge success. Both Sam's family and Claude's family were ecstatic at the enthusiasm and support from the town. Claude had 6 sons to take care of at home, so his success as a businessman with this pharmacy meant the world to him. His youngest son was Tom Stafford, and Tom was about 24 years old at the time of the City Drug Store's grand opening. At the time, he was living in his family home at 738 Meridian Street in Florence.
Tom was also heavily involved in the music scene in Florence and had already made himself a little makeshift recording studio in one of the bedrooms above his father's pharmacy store. One day in 1959, Tom was reading the local newspaper and saw an article talking about how Rick and Billy had written the song Sweet and Innocent. Tom called Rick and Billy and told them he was interested in starting a publishing company with them. He said he had $500 to spend, which was huge to Rick and Billy, and he said he also already had a makeshift studio above his father's pharmacy. Tom invited Rick and Billy over to his little makeshift studio, and the 3 of them ended up having a lot of fun jamming together. They felt as though each one of them could all bring something to the table, so decided to formalize their skills and Tom's studio space and call themselves Fame Studio, which of course is an acronym for Florence, Alabama Music Enterprises. It was also likely in this year year, Rick met a woman named Linda, and the two started to date. Rick, Billy, and Tom continued to work together. In Rick Hall's words, he said this felt like a gold mine, this Tom Stafford situation, that Tom was a total dream come true. They were moderately successful. That is until one random day when Tom and Billy unexpectedly called Rick into their studio office. They basically told Rick they didn't like his personality and they didn't want to work with him anymore. They were like, "You work too hard, you're a workaholic, you're pushy, you're a perfectionist. We want to have fun with this. We don't want it to be all rigid and tough." And Rick was shocked. He was extremely blindsided. He thought things were going really well. Was he passionate in his work? Yes. Was he kind of more of a dominant personality type? Yes. Enneagram 1? Probably. I mean, now we have all of these, personality names for people. But back then, you didn't really have like a personality type. You were just either kind of difficult to work with or not. And they felt like Rick was just too much of a perfectionist. But nonetheless, Rick really was surprised. He was sad and he was angry and devastated. They had been working together maybe not even a year. Tom and Billy not only decided they didn't want to work with Rick anymore, they decided they wanted to dissolve the collaboration entirely.
As I was editing this episode and looking into things a little bit further, I saw that Claude Stafford, Tom Stafford's father, who owned the pharmacy, passed away just 7 years after Tom, Billy, and Rick formed Fame Studios. Claude Stafford passed away in 1966. Part of me thinks Claude Stafford may have gotten sick or decided to retire from the pharmacy business. After all, by the time it was 1960, Claude Stafford would have been about 65 years old and ended up passing away at age 72. So in everything that you see online and in the documentaries, they all say Tom and Billy just couldn't stand working with Rick and wanted to end things because it wasn't fun. But part of me thinks Claude Stafford also could have simultaneously been stepping away from the pharmacy business. That would have meant Tom Stafford would have had to have found a new studio space for him, Billy, and Rick. Maybe they felt like that phase of their life was simply coming to an end.
After this conversation, Rick negotiated with them and was able to keep the rights to the name Fame Studio. Rick didn't know what he was going to do. He definitely couldn't just start a new studio the next day. That is quite the undertaking. But he knew that he had the legal rights to this name should he ever start up again on his own. And of course, he had every anticipation that he would start a studio of his own. In February of 1961, Rick married Linda, and the two of them decided to pack up everything they owned, relocate to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and restart Fame Studios. And this time, in the words of Rick Hall, he was going to kick some ass and take some names. His only option at this point was to make it. Failure was not on the table. Rick takes the car that he's been living in, drives to Muscle Shoals with his new wife, Linda, and they take out a loan for a recording studio. He sets up the studio in the back room of a tobacco shop in Muscle Shoals, which seems super sketchy, has that whole back alley entrance, but he knew this was his chance to make it on his own. He also knew he had to pay back this loan and provide for Linda. Of course, they wanted to start a family as well, so he had every motivation in the world to wake up every day and grind with a capital G. As he describes it, during these years, he wasn't socializing, he wasn't schmoozing, he wasn't going around town, he was playing in bars, maybe here and there, but for the most part, he was sitting alone in his studio space, writing music and working. After a few months of really putting his foot on the gas pedal and focusing and working and praying and being the best version of himself that he could, not going down that road of depression, not going down that road of alcoholism. After a few months of this, divine music intervention strikes Rick Hall's life when a man named Arthur Alexander, who was a bellhop at a local hotel, met Rick Hall and found out Rick Hall had just opened this studio. Now, people are definitely put into your life for a reason. Here on Roots, like I just said, we call it divine music intervention, which, by the way, you can purchase one of my divine music intervention mugs on the Roots Music history storefront, Arthur Alexander was definitely Rick Hall's divine music intervention moment. Upon meeting Rick, Arthur played him his song, You Better Move On. And he asked Rick, hey, what do you think of my song? I wrote it myself. Do you think it's good? I think it's a hit. And Rick said, you know what, Arthur, I love it. Let's cut it. And Arthur was like, okay, when? Rick said, tomorrow. So the next day, Arthur showed up at Rick's little tobacco shop studio. 3 other men who had played with Rick Hall previously also showed up that day. Their names were Norbert Putnam, who played bass, David Briggs, who played piano, and Jerry Kerrigan on drums. These 3 men would become known as the original Muscle Shoals rhythm section. On this day, they not only cut the song, You Better Move On, but an entire album for Arthur Alexander. They released You Better Move On in 1961, and this was the first success to come out of Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals. It was released in late 1961, and by early 1962 had already reached number 24 on the Billboard Hot 100. The success of this song really established Fame Studios and Rick Hall's reputation as a producer. The following year, Fame Studios beat its own record with the release of Everybody by Tommy Roe, and that song skyrocketed to number 3 on Billboard's Hot 100. In 1964, they did it again with What Kind of Fool Do You Think I Am by the Tams. For the next several years, Fame Studio was on fire.
Rick was able to use the proceeds from these early hits to not only pay his loan on his space in the tobacco shop, but move Fame Studios to a bigger and better venue, one that he could own outright at 603 Avalon Avenue in Muscle Shoals. And that is where Fame Studios still stands to this day.
By 1969, Rick Hall was dominating the industry. He had now worked with countless stars, including but not limited to Percy Sledge, Aretha Franklin, Etta James, Otis Redding, and country and pop artists too, like Joe Tex, Mac Davis, and Bobby Gentry. But this wild success didn't come without its obstacles. In 1965, at the peak of Fame Studios' success, Rick Hall's rhythm section, Norbert, David, and Jerry, were all given an offer to expand their network and their skills and go play in Nashville, Tennessee. The group was really excited about this opportunity, but that meant they had to leave Rick Hall and leave Fame Studios. Now, losing his musicians was a huge blow to Rick, but he was able to fill the void fairly quickly. He hired on some now famous names: Barry Beckett, Roger Hawkins, David Hood, and Jimmy Johnson. These guys later would become known as the Swampers. By the way, no one referred to the first 3 guys as the original Swampers, but I like to do that. The move to Nashville for the original trio proved to be a really good business decision for them, by the way, if you were wondering how their lives turned out. They went on to work with very prominent artists like Elvis Presley, Dolly Parton, and Kenny Rogers, just to name a few. And for a few years back in Muscle Shoals, it was business as usual for Rick, Fame Studio, and the Swampers. That was until 1969, when Rick faced another unfortunate Swamper situation. By 1969, Fame Studios, by the way, was doing incredibly well. This was like the peak of their success. And these men who had been playing rhythm section for Rick had, by 1969, reached incredible notoriety in the industry thanks to Rick and Fame Studios. But one thing about Rick, which we know, is that he was extremely passionate about his work. He was all in, 100% all or nothing. And if you remember that conversation with Billy and Tom all the way back from the 50s, Rick had always been a little rough around the edges when it came to work, a little bit of a perfectionist. Rick was all business. As a result of that, his personality, I think, wasn't always the easiest to deal with. And the Swampers, by 1969, were arguably a little worn out from working with Rick for the last few years. And they also wanted the freedom to run their own studio and their own operations. So in 1969, they decided to not only leave Rick Hall, but go literally across the street and start the Muscle Shoals Sound Studio, becoming Rick Hall's biggest competitor. Now, was this a stab in the back to Rick Hall? Kind of seems like it was. Not only did they make this new studio right there in Muscle Shoals, right in Rick's face, but they went full steam ahead, quickly becoming a major force in the industry. Aretha Franklin, who was working with Rick Hall at Fame Studios, left Rick Hall, and went with the Swampers to their studio. And Rick Hall is sitting there like... To me, I see this as another low point in Rick Hall's life, another tragedy, if you will. This man has been through everything. He's been through death. He's been through grief. He's been through guilt. Rick Hall, just like his resilience through everything, is really what makes him the greatest success story of all time. How many people do you know would have seen a Muscle Shoals sound studio open up next door, lose everything, lose their rhythm section, lose Aretha Franklin, lose so much professionally? How many people do you know would just quit? Just close up shop. But not Rick Hall. He was absolutely not a quitter. Now, it was at the Muscle Shoals Sound Studio you started to see acts like the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, and Lynyrd Skynyrd. Muscle Shoals Sound Studio could be a roots rockumentary in itself, but despite this blow to his business, Rick Hall continued in full force, sustaining Fame Studios as a music-producing powerhouse. In 1971, Rick Hall won the award for Producer of the Year. He also maintained a connection with his birth mother, Dolly, if you remember Dolly. Dolly was still living in Alabama, and she eventually remarried. Rick bought them a home and continued to take care of Dolly and her new husband through their elder years, despite the fact Dolly had left the family when he was very young. Rick Hall had several more hit songs peaking in the top 5 after the Muscle Shoals Swampers left, including, but not limited to, Mac Davis's Baby Don't Get Hooked on Me. And that was kind of the beginning where you saw Rick Hall start transitioning more and more into country music. Rick started partnering with several other major record labels in the 70s, such as Atlantic Records, Capitol Records, and RCA. And this helped him attract more high-profile artists and maintain an influence in the industry. Rick knew that the music industry was evolving through the 70s and through the 80s. He continued to pivot where he saw needed in order to maintain his operations and his status. And one of my favorite Rick Hall contributions to the country music scene in the 80s was his production of Shenandoah's early albums, which gave us The Church on Cumberland Road and 24 Roses. In 1997, Rick was getting worried about the encroachment of urban development and what it could mean for the history and legacy of Fame Studios. So he secured its designation on the Alabama Register of Landmarks and Heritage, ensuring its historical preservation for generations to come. Rick Hall was not just a powerhouse in his early years. He continued to work tirelessly through his 60s, 70s, and his 80s. His life and career are profiled in the 2013 documentary film Muscle Shoals. During an interview before the release of the movie, Hall told a journalist that in 2009 he had donated his home to a charity for abused and neglected children. The hits he had recorded over the years and the sale of 2 of his 6 publishing catalogs had made him pretty wealthy, but in spite of that, at the age of 81, he was still trying to make record deals. In 2014, Hall was awarded the Grammy Trustees Award for his significant contribution to the field of recording. Rick Hall published his memoirs in a book titled The Man from Muscle Shoals: My Journey from Shame to Fame. That book was published in 2015, and then in December of 2016, Hall was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of North Alabama in Florence. Rick Hall eventually passed away in 2018 at 86 years old, but his legacy will remain relevant in music history until the end of time. He is truly an American icon. His story of resilience, vision, and an unwavering passion for creativity is an inspiration to all. To this day, Hall's influence reverberates through generations of musicians and producers, reminding people that despite whatever personal personal tragedies or obstacles you may face, if you remain steadfast in your commitment to excellence, even if you were born into the humblest of beginnings, greatness can and will emerge. If you like this type of content, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. You also have the option to give me a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.